Our mic is live.
Yes, it is.
People are saying that they already have.
So 12 minutes to go. It starts at
10.
10 after phone starts. It's 5.
It is. It sure is.
Actually, one minute, 2 minutes.
You know, I can't do logo. I hope they spend more than $10 on
Hello. This is the CIDR meeting at IETF 94. If you're not here for the CIDR meeting or IETF 94, you're in the wrong place. Excellent. No one left. So just quickly, for people that present or go to the mic to ask questions, please don't do this with the mic. Or alternately, don't do this. Don't do this with the mic. Thank you very much. Keep the mic close to your mouth hole. That's where the sound comes out. Everyone's a comedian. Okay, Sandy's going to be ready in just a minute to present, and we'll go. Do we have a jabber and a note taker? All right. So we also need to collect a jabber person, scribe, and a note taker. I think maybe Sue said she was going to do one. Which one? Note taker for Sue. Who's going to do jabber? Jabber, jabber, jabber. Jabber is that XMPP thing that no one uses anymore? That one, yeah. You can remember it. It's the one that came after IRC. Before, maybe. Jabber person? Wes. Oh, John also. Maybe we'll have two. Okay. All right, sweet. Okay, so we'll be all set. All right. Turns out AV's hard. I'm going to go with it's because you have 700 things running on your Mac. Just hit the full screen thing. Thank you. Sweet. All righty, there we go.
So the problem this morning is that, or this evening, is that my low-tech timekeeping machine on my wrist says that it is 2 minutes after 5. And that's not the correct time, so
Off we go.
off we go. Classic note well with all the ifs, ands, buts, and whatevers. Simplified version that says you better keep track of what's in the complex version. But in particular, anything you say at the mic, on the mailing list, in the hallways, mumbling to your sleep at night, if it has to do with the IETF, can be used against you in the court of human opinion. All the resources that you need to find out any information you want to know about the CIDR and the work that it's doing. Lots of different ways to communicate between the audio stream and the Metico and the slides. The blue sheets are already going around and we already have volunteers, so we're done with that. Anybody have any agenda bashing to be done? No? Okay. Working group status, we have a new version of the AS migration draft now that the IDR migration draft is finally kind of baked. The ALGS draft, we have new versions, and actually as of this morning, this is behind. We had working group last calls for the ALGS draft, the overview, and the PKI profiles. We had a late arriving after, just before I was about to hit the button for publication requested, a rather complex issue came up, so we need a new version of the BGPSec protocol draft. There will be a short working group last call to deal with just the changes that were necessary to address that issue. Not interested in doing a wholesale review of the entire document yet again. The Delta protocol has a new version, and we'll hear more about that later in a few minutes. Publication draft got a new version, and the out-of-band setup, and we'll hear more about that today. 6485 BIS is past IETF last call. The last call ended yesterday. And so we're looking forward to publication being approved for that. It'll be an ISG processing. I think it's on the agenda for the 19th. 6490 BIS is in the RFC editor queue, and 6810 BIS is just awaiting the publication to be requested. And RPSL SIG is in a similar state, past working group last call, and new version submitted to deal with the comments and waiting for a publication request. And we have some things that are dead or expired. And I spoke with one of the editors of the origin validation signaling saying, you recall that there are some IDR comments that you need to address. They aren't CIDR comments, they're IDR comments. So I can't help you. And I got a promise of, we'll figure out how to deal with that. Okay. The author involved said that he would communicate with one of the IDR chairs. So, yeah. Some progress in various
Brief
things.
question.
Yes? I'm sorry. Yes.
This is West George. On the AS migration draft, are you
Yes.
planning on just pushing that forward, or are we doing another last call? I mean, I don't think another last call is necessary, but was curious.
You had an issue with the protocol draft that you had to do with the AS migration draft. That needs to be worked out with the protocol draft author. There also was a change that was made to the AS migration draft having to do with, we'll now do this on IBGP sessions, which have to make sure that the protocol draft is now okay with that. Otherwise, it conflicts. And so we'll have to just make sure that those two drafts don't conflict with each other.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure where we stood.
Okay. It depends on if they conflict or not.
Okay. I mean, I've done a fairly thorough review, and I don't believe that they do anymore. And
Right.
even the issue that I raised is not, I don't think it's blocking. You know, it's a minor wording change in the protocol draft, and it'll be handled. So,
Okay. Yeah, I saw the change in the protocol draft too. We have one new draft that was adopted since the last working group, and that's the SLRM draft. David Mandelberg wasn't able to come. Okay. So the agenda today is a discussion of the validation reconsidered. Jeff put in a new version to change the concentration and the motivation from being so much about transfer to consider other things that provide a reason for reconsideration of the validation algorithm. Tim's going to talk about the RRDP, the new transport protocol, and Oleg is going to talk about a view of how to validate a repository in that system. And Rob's going to talk about the out-of-band setup, and Randy's going to talk about router keying, and Randy said that he was going to talk without slides. And if we have time, Rob requests that he might be allowed to make a presentation that was planned for Friday today, because he has travel plans on Friday that will be much less stressful if he doesn't have to be waiting around until the last minute of the CIDR meeting on Friday. So on Friday, we have a remote presentation by Steve Kent about bad things CAs might do, and a presentation by someone else about bad things that CAs might do. And oh golly, look at that. I'm so sorry. Editing error, Rob Austin talking about something on Friday that might be talked about today. So that pretty much ends the chair slides. So first up is validation reconsidered, and Jeff is talking without slides.
Right there, right?
Please.
Right there. Okay. Jeff Houston, APNIC. Still good. Still good. Yes, no slides today. I sent mail to the working group mailing list on last week sometime in response to some revisions that I put forward a little bit earlier. I'm kind of getting a sense of some frustration personally with this particular piece of work, insofar as it's come through this working group a number of times now. It seems to be 2 years, but I could be wrong. And it's just not going anywhere. There's a bunch of folk who go, don't like it, and a bunch of folk who go, like it, and there's no real way of making any progress. I looked hard at the document, and as it stood, this the reconsideration draft is not an appropriate action, because it's trying to update a standard, and as far as I understand the process, it should indeed be a standard itself if it tries to update a specification in the standard. And so in that respect, it's kind of a strange document. It's a bit of a camel, because it has a whole bunch of motivational text. It's actually described as informational, but it's trying to update a standard. So I then sort of floated a personal draft out there, which was the mechanics of the change to the algorithm, nothing more. And got back some comments on the mailing list going, wow, way too brief. So I'm sitting there kind of thinking, too brief, too wordy, what's going on here? Can't seem to find a middle ground. And quite frankly, I've run out of personal drive here. So it's a working group document, but I'm no longer really motivated to press it on myself. So the offer was on the mailing list, and the offer is here. I have the XML. If someone feels motivated because it's still a working group document, take it on. If the working group want to abandon it, that's just fine by me. I just don't feel like this thing is going to move any way or one way or the other personally, so I'm going to walk away from it. So I give you back time unless someone wants to talk at the microphone. You can have, how much do you give me? 30 minutes? You can have 25 minutes of your life back.
Mhm. So you are not the sole author on the validation reconsidered draft.
I'm not.
Have you any communication with your co-authors as to whether any of them are interested in continuing that work?
I could invite any of the co-authors to jump up and say something if they feel sufficiently motivated.
Yes, Tim Rijnsdorf, Right NCC. I'm one of the co-authors. But I agree with Jeff's assessment. I don't think this is going anywhere as it is. And yeah, to be honest, it feels to me like it would be a waste of everyone's time to keep pushing it at this point. Yeah, you know, without saying who's right or wrong about the argument, it's not about that. It just seems that people are on one side and other people are on the other side, and we're not converging. I'm not sure what we can do to make that happen. And if that doesn't happen, well, should we be working on this document still? So, yeah, I don't really feel the urge to do so either.
George Michelson from APNIC. I certainly used to be one of the authors on the document. I'm not even sure if I'm still listed in the current state. This conversation has gone on for years. John
Scudder is nodding his head. I think he's looking at it and he's found your name there.
The conversation's been going on for years, and if we'd achieved a consensus, a rough consensus, we could have shipped this one years ago, because it's a really simple statement. There are two ways of looking at resources in use, and one says everything must be right all the time, and the other one says we'll understand that every question is made contextually about specific resources which may or may not be covered, and we tried to promote that. Most of the room just doesn't want to go there. You can't push a stone uphill, so no, I'm not prepared to carry this work forward.
Randy Bush, IJ. So you've been working on this for a couple of years. For this working group, that's very short. And I mean that. And it's disgusting. Okay. There doesn't seem to be consensus. I agree. I'm the only one who stood up in the WG and said, here's a case for it. I'm not strongly for it. I'm not strongly against it. Right. And I'm kind of understand where Steve Kent's coming from is, you know, if you swallowed this X509 Kool-Aid, you believe in this rigid, and you're whacking on it, and take something to get comfortable with it. I'm not against it or for it, but I think you're losing your patience far earlier than we are over far more critical drafts who've been here for 5 years. So just quit your whining.
This individual doesn't find that argument convincing enough to stay on it as an active author. I'm sorry.
You actually do have my sympathies, Jeff.
Thank you.
You do have my sympathies, Jeff. More for just standing there by yourself and doing it instead of 30 of us trying to push a draft through for 5 years.
Any others of the co-authors? There were at least 5 that I recall, Jeff included.
Carlos from LACNIC. I remember getting in some very heated discussions at the very beginning of this, defending this draft, and I still think this is the right path to go. I think the other validation approach is just too brutal, but I sympathize with Geoff. I mean, it's been hard and frustrating. The whole process has been hard and frustrating. Thanks.
Wes George, not a co-author, no desire to become one. I think there's probably a couple things here. One is, for what it's worth, I appreciate the background information in drafts. I think this working group has a horrible problem with forking drafts into 15 different things, and I don't like chasing information. So I appreciate the original version that had the background information, regardless of the fact that it might run afoul of what IETF believes a standards document ought to have in it. So I appreciate that. As to the more fundamental problem that we can't seem to find consensus, then I would turn that back around to the chairs. What is it that we don't have consensus on, and can we unstick that? It shouldn't be the author's responsibility to address that on their own. If we have a sticking point where we have to at least find rough consensus, even if it's very rough, I look in your direction to help handle that. This shouldn't be a situation where Jeff has to stand at the mic and throw his hands up because we can't seem to come to conclusion. If we can't come to conclusion, do we need to rope in ADs to fix it? You know, there's got to be something we can do here if we agree that this is still a problem. If we don't agree it's a problem, yeah, let's let it die.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like we at least have some people who believe it's a problem.
Okay. So what we have here is two diametrically opposed algorithms and strong camps on both sides and no way to meld the two algorithms and no way to say, pick a way and do it the way that you like, and so that the world is divided into two places. This is, we have to pick one of these two. And that's where we're having trouble coming to consensus, is picking one of the two. So the established, well, yeah, it's.
The reason why the authors put this draft forward is the authors felt, because they are part of the group that is issuing certificates, that a modified validation algorithm would be, as Carlos said, less brittle, because the semantic construct inside the existing validation procedure treats the bundle of resources as having some innate property as a collection.
Right.
But that property is an artifice that is only related to X509 and has no reality in terms of the operational use. I have 3 prefixes and 2 ASs. I use them independently. I don't need to put all 3 prefixes and 2 ASs together every single time I use them. It never happens like that. And so what this draft is trying to do was to say, if you remove that bundling constraint, you actually have a situation where the failure of an encompassing condition down a validation path doesn't cause all subordinate certificates down there to be considered invalid a priori.
Yep.
It only affects the resource, right? So
Right.
we've gone through all that time and time
Yep.
again,
So why
slides,
are we going through
etc.,
it again?
and can't seem to find a headway between folk going pragmatically, this offers better robustness, and folk, as Randy said, you know, they're X509 certificates. How dare you muck with it?
Randy Bush, IJ. Could the chairs get some guts and go on the mailing list and say, looking back historically, there is no consensus. This will fail and we can move on. But one last chance, will those people on either side say, it's okay, let it go? And what you're saying is you'd rather not, and I support that. I think that's fine. I'm not putting down either side. But does anybody here wish to speak strongly against it?
Strongly against what,
This
Randy?
proposal.
The proposal to
Change
Just
the
Please, please. We don't need to explore every rat hole. And take it to the mailing list and say, is there anybody who still strongly objects? And if they don't, it passes. And if they do, there's no consensus. And either way, we're done. And that's a chair's job. It's fun to torture Jeff, but it's getting boring.
Does this mic work?
Yes.
Hi, I'm lazy. Doug Montgomery, on the record as being lazy. I came over here. I remember, one, in concept, I certainly greatly support the idea because of the resistance that we've heard to deployment about a brittle system. But I remember going back at some meeting somewhere, there was discussions of implementations. And I thought I heard conflicting things. One comment being it's difficult to implement, and another comment that it's already implemented in a finite and small set of changes. So could we review the state of implementations, I guess is my real question.
I can comment on implementation. It's actually working in the validator that we have. It's a configuration setting. But for us, it was quite simple. Rather than rejecting a certificate if it's overclaiming, we accept it for the intersection is the word I'm looking for, I guess, of the resources mentioned on the certificate and the parent certificate. And we have code to remember which resources belong to the certificate rather than looking at what's written on it anyway, because we also need to support inherit. So in our case, this was actually quite easy to implement. I don't think that should be a showstopper for this. But yeah, there's the other discussion.
Okay. Rob Ostein. I'm going to present 1.5 positions here. Okay, for my own as an implementer, it's actually fairly straightforward. I have not implemented this myself. I have looked at it. I do not believe it is particularly difficult. It's essentially moving a piece of code that we wrote years ago to a different place. It's a slight tweak. It's not that big of a deal either way. One has to be careful, but it's not that big of a deal. I am now going to go out on a limb here and attempt to do an honest job of channeling somebody else who isn't here. Okay, I have spoken to the folks at BBN. I think their opinion, and this is just my understanding of what I think their opinion is, so if they say I'm wrong, they're correct about that. I believe the way they implemented this, it would be difficult for their implementation because they rely on having checked all the CA certificates all the way down and being able to skip those checks in the future. They're attempting to do some optimization that they think is appropriate, and this breaks that optimization. Now, cutting back to me personally, I hear that, I believe them. I'm not sure how much I care in terms of that optimization being important. I don't know whether or not they have actual data testing to demonstrate that modeling, that optimization is important. They might, I don't know, but I have not heard about any such. My own testing suggests it's not that critical. But there's a potential scaling issue here, and there might be a cost. I don't know. I'm not particularly worried, but I believe they have legitimate concerns there in terms of they optimize something and now this is going to break that.
Rudiger, are you standing because you're going to make a remark?
Yeah, Rüdiger Volk. Well, okay, I'm a little bit reluctant to throw this in because, well, okay, I'm actually asking about things that are kind of slightly aside. Nevertheless, I wonder if the motivation for doing this actually is enforced by the idea that the root certificate resource sets might long-term systematically overlap. Last time I checked the root certificates, I found there were overlaps and they did not seem like temporary things.
Okay, so I don't think any of this changes Jeff's current position. So fair, that's fair. Why don't we have Jeff end his time for this, move on to the next thing. And
I'll
we'll
leave the box.
Thank you. And we can talk about this on the mailing list quickly with some decision process there. That seems better than continued randomness here. So who's up next? And thanks, Jeff. So I presume your offer to hand off the XML still stands. If somebody at the end of the mailing list conversation says, oh, this really is a good idea, let's do that. Okay.
Tim's next.
Won't you look at it? Beautiful, huh? Fresh, released yesterday. Okay, I'd like to talk about our experience implementing the Delta protocol. So next slide, please. Before I go into more details, I wanted to say I think we have had very constructive discussions between the authors on this. These two look like maybe they have some issues to work out, but I think we're getting there. Obviously, I think it's sufficient for us to discuss things one-on-one at times, but I think it's important that the working group is involved. So that's why I'm here again, so that all of you have the opportunity to comment as well. Next slide, please, because I want to avoid that we end up with something like this that we maybe understand, but nobody else does, right? So if anybody feels like reading this, have people read it actually, apart from the authors? Then, well, you would do me a favor. Next slide. Well, to the details, the current state. It has been working in our pilot environment for a while now, I think for about half a year, if I'm correct. Following that and following some discussions here as well, some changes have been made to the document. First of all, HTTPS is now used everywhere. Before that, there was a mix of HTTPS and HTTP. There's a change made in the recommendation about the caching of the notification file. And I, well, at least attempted to improve the readability. But this is also why I ask people to proofread, because you get this blindness about what you write yourself, right? To me, it's clear. But anyway, moving forward, I've also spoken with the implementers of other validators, and we would very much like to deploy this to our production environment to get real-world experience. It would be it would also be supported in our validator, but as a something you have to enable, so as an option, because we obviously don't want to. Well, we want to have more experience before we call this done, obviously. Okay, moving on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a very brief recap. I won't go into all the details this time. You can talk to me privately if you want to know, but essentially a relying party validator is polling a notification file regularly, and that way it can find out about files that contain either snapshots of a repository or deltas, where delta is always the difference between one version of the repository and the next. The notification file gets updated regularly. The other files are very stable, and this is done to support caching. Next slide, please. One of the changes was HTTPS. So in the previous version of the document, the notification file would be fetched over HTTPS. The references to the other files were plain HTTP, and we had hashes for those files so that you could actually verify that they were okay. Now that we're using HTTPS everywhere, I've already removed this part, the hashes, but it's easy to put it back if people see another use for it. So I'd like to get some comments on that.
Rob Austin. Yeah, I am not sure we should be removing those. The reason is they're potentially still useful as an integrity check. I'm not talking about security purposes, really. It's basically just a checksum, right? But I think it's actually useful when shipping these huge things around to have some idea about whether or not you actually got what you expected to.
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Jeff, so other reasons to keep this type of thing around is that, I'll show my name tag later. Not only do you want to have some ability to verify the integrity, the sort of case to think about in the security space a little bit is what happens if the data is subverted on the server itself. This gives you a potential, some potential towards that end, but it also gives you, some ability to potentially locally cache this stuff somewhere in your own network and use those hashes for that purpose.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Well, I can put it back. It's okay. We thought that if you have the syntax checks for the XML, you already catch a lot of issues with corrupted files, stuff like that. But yeah, like I said, I can put it back. There's no problem. Well, next slide then. Caching. So this is the document used to have a lot more on this. I tried to take out overly specific information because caching can be set up in many different ways, and I'm not sure that the document should actually tell people how to do it. But again, that's also something that I like feedback on. If people think it's useful, we can have some stuff, but otherwise I would just leave it and focus on the thing at hand here. When the document mentions caching, it's really talking about the time that these cache servers here can cache content from the central repository server. So next slide, please. First of all, caching is optional. You don't have to use it. If you are confident that everybody can go to your server straight away, that's what you can do. But that notification file I mentioned, we used to have text saying, we used to say 5 minutes of caching maximum. We lowered that to 1 minute now. And also the recommendation to the validator is to not try to fetch more often than once per minute. Now, we believe that this is probably headed towards a better direction because 1 minute of caching already gives you huge performance gain because essentially you're only hit by the cache servers once per minute, and that should be easy enough. Well, the longer you make this time, the longer it takes before relying parties can validate new things that are published. So we also want to keep it short. We had some discussions about this years ago, but I'm going out on a limb here. I expect that if you can find and validate new ROAS in the space of a few minutes, that should also address some of the issues that were raised a while ago, that sometimes you need to make fast changes in BGP, and it's very difficult to communicate the change in configuration and in ROAS if that takes too long. So I'm hoping that a timescale of minutes is good enough for those two systems to converge. But I would really like to have comments from operators on that. Next slide, yeah. Because other than that, well, I mentioned we want to enable this in production because, yeah, we really want to see that it works before we call it done. But from where we're standing, well, except for the hashes and possibly comments on should a minute is a minute enough or too much or whatever. Well, to me, it looks pretty much done. So if you have any concerns about this, or if you are interested, I would really like to ask you to have a look now and comment before we do go for a last call, which is not now, but yeah, again, I want to have proof of running this in production for a while before I go there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Questions, comments?
Jeff Haas' comment about the 1 minute. So a lot of it comes down to what your distribution infrastructure is going to be. If you have something that is, allowing this to be Akamai or something similar, it's less of an issue if you're hitting it once a minute, because your real problem at that point is distributing it across your CDN. But if you don't have some sort of big distribution network at the back end, what you're actually encouraging people to do is hit the thing often, and when things do change, you'll have potentially significant portion of the internet all converging on a single server, or what appears from the outside to be a single server, trying to grab the changes. So I encourage you, as part of thinking about your timings, trying to figure out how you actually want people to grab this stuff and what happens when a significant number of people try to do this all at the same time.
Well,
Yeah.
I was on to the same point, Tim. So, Rob Ostine, there are actually two different timing values you want to think about here. There's the lifetime, the caching lifetime of the notification file, and there's the polling cycle of the relying party. Okay, I've been assuming, perhaps incorrectly, that relying parties would still be keeping a somewhat slower polling cycle. I mean, I'm currently polling once an hour. I don't see any strong reason to change that. What the notification file caching timeout tells you is basically how much delay is built into the caching system. That's the thing we want to keep small. Okay, so I think there's a case to be made for keeping the polling cycle significantly slower than 1 minute, like more like a half an hour, something on that order. But keeping the notification caching thing small so that we don't have a lot of delay built into the caching system.
Yeah, we do get a lot of questions from people using our validator, like, well, why does it take an hour or whatever it takes for my new ROAS to appear in the validator? So that is a question we see regularly. Another question is, of course, well, how relevant is this for routing, as opposed to, well, another use case is that, well, somebody creates it, but if they can also see that it appears and is valid, that's a confirmation that everything worked. So I do think people like to see this. Also, I was hoping, maybe wrongly, but I was hoping that with a caching infrastructure in front of it, well, suppose that every AS in the world runs this, then we're talking like 40,000. And 40,000 hits per minute. I think that's something that we can cope with. It's a lot of data. There's a cost factor there, I suppose, but you can just do a head call to see if it's changed and all that. So I'm not just sure that even with a minute, it would result in a load that we cannot handle if we use a right infrastructure in front of it. Yeah. Well, we would probably not implement it ourselves, but use a CDN, yes. But I'm trying not. Obviously, the draft is written with CDN in mind, but I don't think it needs to be restricted to that. I mean, theoretically, you can also do this yourself in different ways. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. Next is Oleg.
Oleg Muravsky, RAP-NCC. So after all this RRDP work, we also updated our validator to support the new protocol, and we thought it would be nice to the users of our validator to have a document that describes how it actually does things. There was already a draft that discussed possible solutions of how to validate things when you have rsync and RRDP together and some other stuff. So that was revision 01 of this document, but yeah, we decided what we want to go with is basically the description of algorithm and less discussion of possible things and whys. Next slide, please. So yeah, what we have in this version, no, that's the wrong one. Yeah, so what we have basically an informational document. It describes what we have now in our validator. It supports both delta and rsync fetching. And we don't go into details on how we do all the specific validations. For example, we do not discuss how we check whether something is signed correctly or resource sets match between parent and child, but mainly fill the gaps that are not described in other documents. What we also try to do as much as possible is not rely on URI links or rsync URI links in the objects, but there is some other approach. What it gives us is potentially we could support multiple publication points, which is described in another draft, and potentially other retrieval protocols. So next slide. Yeah, what it isn't is this is just one way of doing it. It doesn't mean this is the way to do it and the only way of doing it. Yeah, about the name, why local cache? I think it might be a bit confusing because some other documents use the same term in a bit different, with a bit different meanings. So they mean a cache of already validated objects. In our case, it's basically a store of objects that are fetched either via rsync or RRDP. Not necessarily valid. So in the text of document, we use term object store, and yeah, maybe we'll reconsider the name of the draft to have something more meaningful. Yeah, so as I said, because we use both a HTTP and rsync, possibly you could have multiple objects with the same URI, because URI in RRDP is not the, well, it's just an attribute on an object. So yeah, there could be some possibilities. So yeah, what I mean is that rsync URI is not a unique identifier of object anymore. And what we also do to achieve this whole validation working is we separate retrieval of objects from their validation. And next slide describes more what I mean. Yeah, so the idea is pretty simple. We have an engine that does validation, the fetcher that does fetching, and the store where we keep objects. Looks pretty simple. So these fetch URIs, yeah, could be anything. If in future, even if we want something else, it could be some other protocol. It could also be multiple protocols, so we could extract multiple URIs and pass them to fetcher, store them in a store, process all in the same way. But more importantly, next slide, is what we could do with RRDP easily is we could have a watcher on top of it, which could basically check the notification XML URI that we have for a repository. And in case of RRDP, the polling of that file for changes is essentially just a HTTP head request on that URI. And when we detect changes, we could kick engine to revalidate repository again. So this is where this 1 minute thing that we just discussed could be easily implemented in this case. With rsync, it's also possible, but it becomes much more difficult. Well, more difficult.
Next one.
And yeah, what I also mentioned, we have different approach now on how we discover objects. So on the left side, you see the traditional way. When we have a certificate, it has an rsync URI pointer to the publication point, and rsync URI pointer to the manifest, which is supposed to be at the same place. And then from the manifest, you have a list of entries that have file names, which are also supposed to be at the same publication point. And one of them is CRL, and we also have CRL-DP pointing to the same place. We do not use that to discover objects in our new implementation, but we rather use the AKI, SKI fields for that. So when we want to fetch an object, we basically go to our store, look it up by hashes, so either AKI or the hash which is mentioned on manifest instead of file name. But we also do all the sort of traditional validation. So we do check that the names match and hashes match and it's all in the correct place. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, and well, what's next is we want to still improve the document. It's very work in progress. Provide more details probably in the choices we made, specific choices why we do things in a certain way. And we think it's useful for this working group to have such a document, not only for our users, but in general. So we want to have your opinion on it. Plus, since we describe the algorithm, please look at it, think about possible problems with it, provide a feedback.
Speaking as another implementer who might have to do this, yeah, please write this down.
Yeah, that's basically it. Question? Discussion?
Are you asking whether people want you to produce text that describes this, or are you asking for working group adoption of something you've yet to
Yeah,
write?
I think we could go for a working group adoption.
Okay.
So if the current text is good enough for that, then we'd like to have that.
Okay.
Or otherwise, we will improve it and do it later.
Okay.
I just want to, Tim Bruins was right. I just want to confirm what Oleg says. Yeah, I've been presenting this like in between the scaling stuff earlier as well. We think it's very useful to have a document for ourselves, for our users, and we would very much like to make it a working group document, an informational document, obviously, because we'd also like the working group to scrutinize it. So if the working group is willing to do that, that would be great. Otherwise, yeah, we could look into different ways of documenting this, and maybe it doesn't need to be an internet draft, but I would prefer that it was.
Okay. Are there interoperability concerns? No, really. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
All these tall people. Okay, if the chairs would be so kind as to go temporarily to slide 4, you may be able to cut this short. Okay, that is all that has changed in the last 2 years as we added one URI. All right, now I'm perfectly happy to go through the whole presentation on how this protocol works for people who don't remember it anymore, but I thought I'd give the working group the option to say, okay, fine, let's go.
Does everybody here remember what this protocol does?
Does
Raise
anybody
your
here
hand if you
remember what this
remember.
does? Okay, go back to the beginning. Sorry? Yes, if you don't, do read the document if you actually want to know. Seriously though, do people actually want me to explain how the protocol works? Because otherwise there's really just a few questions about it and then we're done. And we can move on to the other presentation.
Okay.
I'm not hearing loud cries of explain this. Okay, anybody who wants the overview, the slides are posted, you can review it. If you could go to the questions at the end, please.
I'm sorry.
Next steps. Theoretically, if you click on that, it'll just take you there. There you go. So one thing that has happened is I wrote, I even posted this to the working group mailing list, I believe, an XSL transform that can actually translate between the old version that other people have implemented and the version that's in the current specification. Anybody who's actually implemented the old one, please test this transform so we know whether or not it really is possible to mechanically translate. I think it is. I've tested it. It seems to work for me, but I could be wrong.
How many people are using this, out of curiosity? One?
Last I heard, I believe, RIPE NCC's implementation, Aaron's implementation, and APNIC's implementation all had partial implementations of this. As far as I know, I'm the only one who actually implemented the entire protocol because nobody else was doing the publication protocol setup stuff. But I believe the other implementations all did the first part, which is what the transforms cover. So please test, plea. All right. I'm guessing the working group still wants this, but it would probably be good to confirm that before we put a lot of more work into pushing the draft out. The question is, do we actually have more work to do here? The one thing I know of that somebody requested, I believe it was Dr. Kent, said he wanted more explanation of how the BPKI certificates were set up. That's a fair request, but I'm not sure it belongs in this document. What this document is about is shipping the BPKI certificates we have around and shipping a bunch of URIs that go with them, okay? They are what they are. They're what we're using. The fact that nobody's ever bothered to specify them, well, arguably that is indeed a problem, but that doesn't change the fact that they're what we're using. So the question is, do we actually need to make this document wait for a specification of what the BPKI looks like? Open question, that's for the working group to decide. I can't decide that one for you. And other than that, does this need to wait for the publication protocol or should we just ship this?
Questions on the mailing list?
That's fine.
Okay. Alrighty.
Okay, with that, I guess, unless there are questions, we're done with this one. Does that leave enough time to go into the other one?
What time is it? Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions? Last chance. No movement, done.
To the beginning. Okay, so this is an update of a presentation I've done periodically. I haven't done this one in a couple of years. And some of the graphs in this are more interesting than the others, but we can skip over the ones that the people get bored by. Just as an explanation, every single one of the graphs, there are two pictures. There's one that's a linear scale and there's one that's a semi-log scale, just because the numbers and some of them are sufficiently disproportionate between some of the repositories and some of the other repositories that without using both scales, you can't actually see what's going on here. Okay, so we've been running an RPKI validator on one particular server in Seattle for 4 years, well, longer than 4 years, but we've been keeping records of everything it reported in its validation status for 4 years now. And we throw this stuff into a program that crunches and crunches and crunches and comes up with these pictures. It's all really the same data that we've been looking at all along. This is all still rsync, by the way. We do not have RRDP in this mix anywhere yet. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, brief overview of how RPKI validation works. Read the slides on the website if you really need to know and you don't remember yet. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the first basic one. That's just objects. Any kind of RPKI object in the various repositories. Now, we're not actually tracking every repository because, or rather, we're not reporting it. We are tracking them, but because at the moment, nobody's really doing the up-down protocol, the ones that are actually worth reporting in this explanation are basically just the RIR repositories and one of the ones that Randy and I operate, just for some contrast. We are not trying to follow all the places where people are doing up-down protocol off of test repositories and stuff like that, because it would be a very noisy slide. When we get to a point where we're actually doing significant up-down protocol, we're going to have to change the way we graph this because it's not going to fit on a picture like this. But with just the RIR repositories, you can see RIPE has been on a pretty steady climb there. I'll explain what these vertical spikes are in a couple slides. APNIC actually, before any of this started, APNIC was the leader. APNIC had significant numbers of RPK objects before anybody else did. But they've been pretty flat, actually. They're going up a little, but not very much. LACNIC has actually passed them at this point. Aaron is not there yet, but they're heading up. Okay, next slide, please. Same picture, semi-log scale. Afrinic still doesn't have a significant number of objects, and the brown one is the CA repository that Randy and I operate. Half of the stuff in there is actually for workshops, but and there are actually going to be some idiosyncrasies you're going to see in the data for that one, just because a significant number of the objects in that one come and go depending on workshop status. Okay, next slide, please. So those big vertical spikes are generally something really bad. It's either something really bad that happening or something really bad being cleaned up, which depends. But you know, things like rekeying the entire universe because you missed something and your top level certificate timed out, oops. They cause those spikes. Other than that, it tends to be pretty steady. Okay. Next, please. Okay, this is just rsync connection counts. Okay, so the most notable thing here is that RIPE was huge and then RIPE stopped being huge. Okay, this was when RIPE moved over. I don't know how many people still remember the terminology we were using for this hierarchical publication. It refers to the structure of the repository, and this is basically an artifact of rsync. Because of the way rsync works and the way we're doing a tree walk for the certificate hierarchy, you get a much more efficient use of rsync if you make all of the subordinate CAs be child directories of the parent CA. That's what we call hierarchical publication. We were advocating that for a long time, and for a long time nobody was doing it. And then one day, RIPE changed to using hierarchical publication, and whomp, you can see they fall down to the bottom, to the point where they're almost lost in the noise. Because they're now, it takes like, I think the first 6 months they were doing it, it took 5 connections to sync all of RIPE, and then they fixed some trivial bug and it went down to 2. So there's 1 to get the trust anchor, and there's 1 to get everything else. LACNIC followed the same thing, I believe, about 6 months later. APNIC, well, they're stubborn. Okay, they have their way of doing it, and they haven't changed it. So it's still, I think it's like half a dozen objects per rsync session is what it works out to roughly. And that's been very steady. I'll explain what the vertical spikes on this are in a minute too. Okay. And Afrinic is basically the same pattern as APNIC with smaller numbers because I believe they're using the same code base still. I don't know whether they made any administrative decision whether to structure it that way or not, but they're using the same code, so I'd expect the same results. Okay, next slide, please. Same picture, semi-log scale. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this business with misinterpreted rsync exit codes is unfortunate. This is one of the big reasons that I will not be sorry if and when we all go to RRDP. We kind of have to treat rsync as a black box, but its error reporting is a little strange. There's more on this later as well. There's a lot of stuff for which it's like, well, you got error code 23. What does error code 23 mean? Well, it means a whole bunch of different things depending on exactly what happened. You know, it might have been your network connection was killed. It might be that someone used a bad URI. It's like, it's error code 23. Good luck with that. So, yeah, the only other thing I'd add here that isn't already covered is it's important to remember that the whole hierarchical publication thing probably goes away with RRDP. There may be interesting things in RRDP land that we haven't discovered yet that are just as weird, but we don't know what they are yet. I don't think we realized the extent to which the hierarchical publication thing was going to be an issue for rsync until we'd started doing at least initial deployments. It was just one of these things that started biting us. It was like, whoops. So, you know, who knows what's lurking in RGP, but we don't know of any of those yet. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is, I have to be careful because one of the early reviewers of the slide deck massively misinterpreted this one. This is literally the number of connections ratio the number of objects. Okay, so the number of objects divided by the number of connections. It's not how many objects were fetched per that connection. It's just the previous two slides as a ratio. Okay, so you can see when RIPE went to a very small number of connections, the number of objects per connections went way up. That's not because we suddenly started transferring tens of thousands of objects from RIPE. It's just because we're now using a handful of connections and we're still handling the same number of objects from RIPE. As with the other slides, generally these huge spikes mean, oops, something bad happened, it gets cleaned up and then life goes on. Okay. And as with the other ones, you can see the, unsurprisingly, the places where they're managing, all the RIRs that are actually managing to lump most of their data into a handful of connections, the number of objects per connection goes up, big surprise. Meanwhile, APNIC and AFRINIC stay very steady. Next slide, please. Okay. Pretty much what you'd expect from what I was just mumbling about. The only thing I have to add to this one is I don't know what the hell is going on with the brown one. That's our own repository, ca0.rpguy.net. Something weird happened there. I don't know what this was. It might have been related to workshop data. It might have been related to us not paying attention to that repository for a little while because we were busy with other projects. I don't know. I really don't know what this one means. Okay. Sorry, Randy?
The lower is the normal.
Yes, the lower is normal. I don't know what this, I don't know what the high part is. I don't know why it was acting that way. Okay, next please. Okay. This is just how many seconds it takes to fetch an object. And you'll probably see more on the, actually go to the next slide because you can see the couple of spikes here. Okay. So it's, each of these repositories is pretty consistent, but this is where the data starts to get a little strange. Other than what I just said, I don't really know what this means. The cases where you've got the really high spikes here are generally where something is just a connection is stuck. Okay, there have been times we've had particular problems talking from Seattle to AFRINIC. We don't know that this is anything AFRINIC is doing wrong, just something on the path between us and AFRINIC is often unhappy. So we often see very, very poor results retrieving from AFRINIC. That's not necessarily anything they're doing. There was a period of time when we saw very bad results from LACNIC. They did serious work to clean up something. I'm not sure what the details were, but it got a lot better. It should not be surprising that the brown one is mostly fast, given that's in the same rack as the machine doing the measurement. And Aaron being close, yeah, well, it's also North American. We're well connected and they're well connected, so it ought to be fast. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh yeah, the parallelism thing. This confuses people. It is possible to run more than one rsync connection in parallel. Okay, we generally do this particular machine that's doing these samples is configured to run 10 in parallel. It was not when we very first started. Part of the reason we continue to present this is if it were just a single one running it is because when we started, we didn't have that parallelism feature. So in order to get any kind of consistent reporting, we had to keep it that way. It does not, in fact, take as long as you would gather from this because we're doing 10 connections in parallel. That's for the ones where we can do 10 connections in parallel. The downside of the hierarchical publication thing where we only need one connection to talk to RIPE is it's only one connection. You can't make it parallel. It's one connection. It takes however long it takes. Okay. That has not been a problem to date. If we were to continue doing this and RIPE were to grow by another order of magnitude or so, it might be an issue, but we're hoping to be on RRDP by that point. The real reason for having the parallelism feature is actually not this anyway. The real reason for the parallelism feature is simply not to have validation get stuck when one particular repository just isn't answering. This used to happen to us a lot back in early testing days. There was one particular guinea pig who were really, really sweet people. They were trying really hard, but they had some organizational thing they could never quite get their repository outside their firewall. It worked for them, but so every time we tried to validate against them, we'd hang for, until TCP gave up, and it was just every hour it would do this. So the parallelism thing meant that at least we could go on and do everything else while we were waiting for that to time out. Okay. And yeah, again, we don't know how much of this applies to RDP, probably not a lot, but RDP is going to have its own dynamics. Okay, next please. So average connection duration, this shouldn't be surprising. RIPE, the average connection duration is actually fairly long. Some of that may be error related, but some of it's just there's a lot of data. So you would expect the connection duration for our connections to RIPE to be longer than our connections to APNIC. APNIC, most of the connection time, to be honest, is spent on the setup and teardown, which is about when we measured it 8 years ago, was something on the order of 500 milliseconds for the setup and teardown, and that's where most of the overhead goes. Connection durations to Afrinic, again, it may just be connectivity issues between us and them. We don't really know. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, I really don't know what's going on with CA0 there. Other than that, the stuff is relatively consistent, except for the places where people change the publication algorithm. Okay. Next, please. Okay, so the 500 millisecond I was just talking about, we haven't seen anything to contradict the 500 millisecond setup and teardown. That still seems to be holding, and so for large numbers of small connections, that still tends to dominate the traffic. There was a period of time when we were topping out. Most of the connections never took longer than 300 seconds, 300 seconds. And when they took 300 seconds, it was because something had hung. So it was at 300 seconds, we'd kill a dead connection. These days, sometimes we have active connections that are lasting longer than that. So that's actually a change. We don't really know what's going on with the RIPE thing here. There's a bit more on that when we get to the next slides about error stuff. Okay, next, please. Okay, this is probably the flakiest of all of the graphs because it's actually fairly hard to measure errors. What we're doing here is essentially keeping track of, it's a sliding window. Out of the last n connection attempts, I don't remember what n is, it's something on the order of 10. But out of the last n connection attempts, how many failed, right? And that's what we're graphing here. So when that number goes up, it means we're getting a lot of connection failures. When it goes down, it means we're not getting a lot of connection failures. Part of the reason that we're using such a lame measurement is, again, rsync. We don't get a lot of data back from rsync. What we get back is, did it work or didn't it work? So we're making do with what we've got. But you can see the period when we're starting to have trouble with longer connections to RIPE, we're also getting a higher error rate. I don't know what that's about. Okay. Next, please. It's the same data. And at this point, this is noisy enough. We really don't know what this means. Okay, we included it because we were able to measure it, and it gives a little bit of insight into some of the other things like the traffic levels, but I wouldn't take the error rates here too seriously. It's more a hint of things to look for than anything else. I think that's it. Next, please. Yeah. So the vague correlation between the error rates and the longer connection times with RIPE is worth looking into. That might indicate a problem. We're not sure, but it's a hint. rsync again. Okay, these error codes are just annoying. We don't really have any alternative but to treat it as a black box, but it's just a pain to do any kind of figuring out what happened. I mean, we could do a little bit more by trying to screen scrape, but when you get to the point where you're trying to screen scrape, what did rsync say when it was talking to the user? It's pretty ugly, and at that point, it's very unstable from release to release. Next, please. So we still don't have any measurement for freshness. I've still not figured out how to measure that. It's probably something we ought to be paying attention to, but we don't have a good measurement for it. Somebody can come up with an algorithm for that. That would be awesome. Clearly, we're going to want to do something kind of like this kind of measurement for RDP. There's no point in doing RDP measurement now because this is basically measuring deployed servers. There are no deployed servers yet, so there's nothing we can do yet. But at some point in the near future, we hope to have some, and we ought to be tracking this sort of stuff. Other things we ought to be tracking, suggestions are welcome. I don't know that I'll necessarily be the one doing this for the next round, but whoever's doing it probably ought to be tracking some of this stuff. Next, please. Yeah, so any questions?
Yeah, Tim Ruijsels, RIPE NCC.
A little louder, please, Tim.
Tim Ruijsels, RIPE NCC. A comment on the freshness. Well, as far as I know, it's not required by the standards, but we put a signing time on the EE certificate of the manifest whenever we publish. And I think, well, also this update time is in there. So that might be something that you could use.
That's good for recent data. I probably should have defined the term better. The sense in which I meant it was how close is what the relying parties are seeing to the master copy that's on the repository. How close are they staying in sync? Okay. In theory, if everybody had perfect connections all the time, everybody's in sync and everybody's fresh. But as we know, connections fail. All the implementations are designed to tolerate a certain amount of sliding through periods when I couldn't get a connection. You just go with what you had from before, do the best you can. So the question is, how well are the relying parties doing at staying in sync with the repositories? And yes, definitely, certainly for anything that's recent, signing times and certificate issue times are a good hint, but there's probably some cases with existing data that hasn't been changed for 6 months, but it's still the freshest thing there. So the question is, how do you measure that?
Jeff Haas, effectively what you're asking for is some sort of log file that just basically says this is how often the manifest has been updated. If you literally had nothing but a set of timestamps for a given version, that would sort of give you the data you're looking for. And you don't even need to make that sort of a required document that's in the set of things that we're tracking. It could just be a bit of operational thing you could pull from the server.
So the manifests do already have the timestamps on the next publication, and you have some concept of manifest staleness. So yeah, if
you want the full set though, you want to be able to say that no.
So yeah, you could perhaps infer something from that. That's a good point. Thank you.
Andy Newton, Aaron. Regarding the measuring of up down, we had two people doing up down with two organizations doing up down with us. I think we only have one now, and one of them. If you're going to try to measure rsync connections with them, they were kind of letting their server go offline consistently. And when we contacted them about it, their response on that was they had read the RFCs, and according to them, they didn't have to keep it up all the time. So,
ouch. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, thanks.
That's the end of the agenda for today. I do have a couple of process comments. We've had a couple of working group last calls recently where there were a tiny number of comments, a very, very tiny number of comments. It's difficult to judge consensus when the authors are dealing with adequately with a couple of comments, but there's only a very, very few. The two examples most recently were crypto stuff, and I'm guessing that a lot of the people here just didn't want to take a look at crypto stuff. But even so, please do try to look at the drafts when they come through working group last call. It's ever so much better for results. I'm trying to poke some people right now to give some additional reviews for those things that have just recently gone through working group last call. Another item, the routing ADs are encouraging every working group to consider whether or not drafts that are what they kind of lump together as process drafts, overviews, use cases, requirements documents, things of that sort, are really of value to the future of the RFCE system. These things tend to be true and published, but they become quickly overtaken by events. So we actually have a couple of drafts right now, an overview document and a use cases document. So when we consider publication requests for those, it'll just want the working group to give a little additional thought as to whether or not these things would be something that would still be of value 5 years from now, and whether it's enough use to put the publication system through the effort of actually producing an RFC. I think that's about it. Anything else I'll talk about on Friday. So on Friday, we will have less to talk about because Rob's presentation was today. So we'll have two talks about bad things CAs might do. We're done here, and see you on Friday. Okay, we'll be looking for new volunteers for JaperScribe and Notes Taker on Friday. All right? Okay. Oh, that'd be good.
If the blue sheets in the back would be great if someone could run to the front, please. Or just point out where they are and I'll come get them.
So I...